I wanted to take you to a little-known port called Italia, which is important in one of the stories of Paul and Barnabas and John Mark in the first missionary journey. See, Paul and Barnabas were set aside for the ministry in a beautiful prayer meeting with fasting, and God called them to go on the first journey to Asia Minor. And then Barnabas decides that he wants to take his cousin John Mark, and they both agree. And they're on their way. They go to Cyprus. They have a very significant ministry there. And then the first place they'll go is Perga, just up the river from this port of Italia. And then it tells us in Acts 13:13 that John Mark will leave and go back home. He goes back to Jerusalem, where his family is very important in the church. We don't hear more about this relationship until Acts 15. Verse 37, Barnabas wants to take John, also called Mark, on another journey. And it says, "But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia," the name of this region, "and had not continued with them in the work." In other words, Paul saw John Mark as someone who had not stayed committed to the trip. And the first missionary journey had a very significant ministry all throughout Asia Minor, north of us here. And Paul and Barnabas would eventually come back through Perga and here Italia, and themselves go back across the Mediterranean. Well, it turns out that the story about John Mark is not over here. There is a dispute between Paul and Barnabas which actually fuels the mission of the church in the book of Acts. We've seen prayer and obedience. We've seen persecution and scattering. But in this case, there's just simply well-meaning, well-intentioned dispute which leads to the kind of fracturing, the creative, constructive fracturing of the missionary effort. And as a result, the gospel goes out with more teams. Now, interestingly, Paul has a seeming reconciliation with John Mark because we read in Colossians 4:10 about John Mark being with Paul as he sends a welcome. We read in Philemon 23 about John Mark as a fellow worker. We read in 1 Peter 5:13 about my son, Mark. And then in that precious last letter that Paul writes in 2 Timothy, he says in 4:11, John Mark is useful to me. Now, Paul may have mellowed, or it may be that just over time, Paul in his own way reconciled with John Mark, and John Mark becomes useful to the ministry, and this becomes co-opted as a part of how God gets the gospel out to the whole world.